Welcome back to Global Currency Watch. If you've been following the Iraqi Dinar story for years, today's video could completely change how you look at everything happening right now. Because this week, while most people were focused on rate predictions, exchange rumors, and speculation about timing, something much bigger happened, and almost nobody is talking about it. The truth is, the biggest development this week wasn't a rate. It wasn't a bank screen. It wasn't a redemption center rumor. It was a signal coming from inside Iraq itself, a signal that may explain why so many pieces suddenly appear to be moving in the same direction. Now, before we go any further, if you enjoy clear analysis without the hype, make sure you subscribe to Global Currency Watch and turn on notifications, because what we're discussing today isn't about fantasy. It's about understanding the real-world developments shaping Iraq's economic future. And trust me, by the end of this video series, you'll understand why many long-time observers believe Iraq may be entering the most important phase of its economic transformation. Let's begin. For years, investors have asked the same question. What is the final obstacle? Is it the budget? Is it the banking reforms? Is it the HCL? Is it political stability? This week, according to MNT Goat, a source inside the Central Bank of Iraq offered an answer that may be more important than anything we've heard in months. The source reportedly said, "Watch Iran carefully. Iran is the key, not the exchange rate, not the budget, not the banking audits. Iran." Think about that for a moment. When someone inside the institution responsible for monetary policy points to a specific geopolitical factor, that's not random commentary. That's a clue. And once you understand that clue, many of the developments we've been tracking suddenly begin making sense. The discussions about militia integration, the financial pressure being applied to certain groups, the regional negotiations, the diplomatic meetings, the security conversations, viewed separately, they look like ordinary political news. Viewed together, they begin to look like pieces of a larger plan, a plan aimed at creating the conditions Iraq needs before it can move into the next phase of its economic evolution. And that's where our story begins. The rate everyone is talking about. As we continue here on Global Currency Watch, let's move to the topic that has dominated discussions across the Dinar community this week, the rate. Because whether you've been invested for 6 months or 16 years, eventually every conversation seems to come back to the same question. What will the Iraqi dinar be worth? And this week, that question exploded once again after comments made by Frank26. Within hours, social media posts, forum discussions, and YouTube clips were circulating everywhere. People were sharing numbers, making calculations, dreaming about outcomes. Some were excited, others were skeptical. But here's the problem. Most people focused on the numbers while completely missing the framework behind them. And the framework is where the real story lives. According to Frank's analysis, the dinar would not simply appear at some final destination value overnight. Instead, he described a process, a journey, a sequence of events, and understanding that sequence may be more important than any specific number attached to it. Frank suggested that when the rate first becomes internationally visible, it could emerge somewhere around the $1.15 to $1.20 range. Now, whether that exact number proves correct isn't the point. The important thing is that he described it as a starting point, not an ending point. A beginning? That distinction changes everything, because many investors unconsciously imagine a single moment, a single announcement, a single exchange opportunity. One day the rate is low, the next day it's finished. But real financial systems rarely work that way. Real markets evolve, real currencies move, real valuations develop over time. And that's exactly what Frank was describing. A currency entering a larger international environment and gradually finding its market value. Think about some of the world's strongest currencies. They weren't created overnight. Trust wasn't built overnight. Demand wasn't created overnight. Value developed through participation, confidence, investment, and economic strength. And that brings us to a question every investor should be asking themselves right now. What happens if the initial rate isn't the final rate? Suddenly, your decision-making process becomes much more important, because now you're not simply waiting for an event, you're preparing for choices, and choices require planning. Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario. An investor has waited years. The announcement finally arrives. The rate appears. Excitement floods the community. News spreads everywhere. Friends start calling. Family members begin asking questions. Banks become busy. Social media explodes. The emotional pressure becomes enormous. What does that investor do? Exchange immediately. Wait. Exchange part of their holdings. Hold some back. The rate everyone is talking about. As we continue here on Global Currency Watch, let's move to the topic that has dominated discussions across the dinar community this week, the rate. Because whether you've been invested for 6 months or 16 years, eventually every conversation seems to come back to the same question. What will the Iraqi dinar be worth? And this week, that question exploded once again after comments made by Frank26. Within hours, social media posts, forum discussions, and YouTube clips were circulating everywhere. People were sharing numbers. Making calculations, dreaming about outcomes. Some were excited, others were skeptical. But here's the problem. Most people focused on the numbers while completely missing the framework behind them. And the framework is where the real story lives. According to Frank's analysis, the dinar would not simply appear at some final destination value overnight. Instead, he described a process, a journey, a sequence of events, and understanding that sequence may be more important than any specific number attached to it. Frank suggested that when the rate first becomes internationally visible, it could emerge somewhere around the $1.15 to $1.20 range. Now, whether that exact number proves correct isn't the point. The important thing is that he described it as a starting point, not an ending point. A beginning? That distinction changes everything, because many investors unconsciously imagine a single moment, a single announcement, a single exchange opportunity. One day the rate is low, the next day it's finished. But real financial systems rarely work that way. Real markets evolve. Real currencies move. Real valuations develop over time. And that's exactly what Frank was describing. A currency entering a larger international environment and gradually finding its market value. Think about some of the world's strongest currencies. They weren't created overnight. Trust wasn't built overnight. Demand wasn't created overnight. Value developed through participation, confidence, investment, and economic strength. And that brings us to a question every investor should be asking themselves right now. What happens if the initial rate isn't the final rate? Suddenly, your decision-making process becomes much more important, because now you're not simply waiting for an event, you're preparing for choices, and choices require planning. Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario. An investor has waited years. The announcement finally arrives. The rate appears. Excitement floods the community. News spreads everywhere. Friends start calling. Family members begin asking questions. Banks become busy. Social media explodes. The emotional pressure becomes enormous. What does that investor do? Exchange immediately. Wait. Exchange part of their holdings. Hold some back. Those decisions cannot be made intelligently if they're being made for the first time during an emotional event. That's why preparation matters. The best decisions are usually made before the pressure arrives, not during it. And that's something many investors overlook, because it's easy to spend years studying rates. It's much harder to spend years studying strategy. Yet strategy is what determines outcomes, not excitement, not emotion, not panic. strategy. And that's where Frank's comments become valuable regardless of whether his exact numbers ultimately prove accurate. He isn't simply talking about a rate. He's describing a process that forces investors to think beyond the headline, beyond the excitement, beyond the fantasy, toward actual decision-making. Now let's go even deeper, because Frank also discussed the possibility of a floating rate, and that idea deserves attention. A float means the market participates, supply participates, demand participates, investor confidence participates. The currency isn't locked permanently into one fixed value. Instead, it has room to move, room to discover where buyers and sellers believe it belongs. That's a fundamentally different concept than many people imagine. And if such a process occurs, patience may become just as important after a rate announcement as it was before one. Think about that. Most investors spend years believing patience ends when the announcement arrives. But what if patience becomes even more important afterward? What if the biggest financial decisions happen after the excitement begins? That's the possibility Frank's framework presents. And whether you agree with his projections or not, that question deserves serious consideration, because successful investors aren't simply people who recognize opportunities. Successful investors are people who know how to manage opportunities once they arrive, and that requires preparation, not guessing, not hoping, preparation. Now, before we move to the next part of this story, I want you to think about something. Imagine two investors, both hold the same amount of dinar, both waited the same number of years, both received the same opportunity, but one investor has spent time preparing, learning, planning, thinking through possible scenarios. The other investor has only focused on rumors and rate predictions. Which investor is more likely to make the better decision? The answer is obvious, and that's why understanding the process may ultimately be worth far more than understanding a number. Because numbers create excitement, processes create results, and as we're about to see in the next part of this story, another major voice in the dinar community delivered a message this week that could save investors thousands of dollars if they actually listen to it. And surprisingly, it has nothing to do with the exchange rate itself. It has everything to do with what happens when the opportunity finally arrives. The banking strategy that could save you thousands. Welcome back to Global Currency Watch. So far, we've talked about the biggest signal coming from inside Iraq. We've discussed why the Iran situation may be the final gate. And we've explored Frank's framework of an initial rate followed by a potential float. But now we're arriving at something even more important, because none of that matters if you aren't prepared for what comes next. Think about that carefully. For years, investors have spent countless hours discussing rates. Some have calculated potential returns hundreds of times. Others have followed every article, every conference, every rumor, and every update. But surprisingly few people have spent time preparing for the actual exchange process itself. And that's where this week's comments from Jeff become incredibly important. Jeff was asked a question that has circulated through the dinar community for years, a question that continues to create confusion, a question that has generated endless debate. The question was simple: do you believe in contract rates? Without hesitation, Jeff said no. He explained that he does not believe in a special secret contract rate operating outside normal banking channels. Now, whether you agree with Jeff or not isn't really the point. What matters is the practical lesson hidden inside his answer. Because while investors continue debating contract rates, redemption centers, and special exchange scenarios, there is one thing almost everyone agrees on: relationships matter, especially in banking. Let's imagine two investors. Investor number one walks into a bank on exchange day completely unknown. No banking relationship, no private banking contact, no prior communication, no preparation, no understanding of available services. Investor number two has already established relationships. They know who to call, They understand the institution's wealth management services. They have discussed large transactions before. They know the decision makers. Which investor do you think will have a smoother experience? Which investor is more likely to understand their options? Which investor is more likely to negotiate favorable terms? The answer isn't complicated. Preparation creates leverage, and leverage creates opportunity. This isn't unique to currency exchanges. It's true in business. It's true in investing. It's true in life. The people who prepare usually perform better than the people who react. That's why Jeff's comments matter, not because they settle the contract rate debate, but because they redirect attention towards something investors can actually control. Preparation. You cannot control the rate. You cannot control the timing. You cannot control geopolitical developments, but you can control how prepared you are. And that matters more than many people realize. Now let's talk about private banking, because this is an area many investors overlook. Private banking isn't just for billionaires. It's designed for clients with significant assets or significant financial activity. These departments exist specifically to handle larger transactions, wealth management strategies, and customized financial services. And if a major currency event occurs, those relationships may become extremely valuable. Think about it. Would you rather navigate a life-changing financial transaction alone, or have experienced professionals helping you understand options, structures, and opportunities? Again, the answer is obvious. Preparation isn't about predicting the future. It's about positioning yourself for multiple possible futures. And that's exactly what smart investors do. Now, here's where things become interesting. Because while many people focus entirely on the exchange itself, sophisticated investors understand something important. The exchange is not the finish line. It's the starting line. Let me say that again. The exchange is not the finish line. It's the starting line. Because receiving funds is only the beginning. What happens afterward matters just as much, maybe more. How will you structure those funds? How will you protect them? How will you invest them? How will you manage taxes? How will you create long-term financial security? These questions don't magically answer themselves, and the people who wait until the last minute to think about them often make expensive mistakes, very expensive mistakes. Which brings us to another important point. Many investors spend years imagining what they'll do with the money. New homes, travel, business opportunities, retirement, financial freedom. And there's nothing wrong with dreaming. Dreams are powerful, but dreams without planning can become problems. History is filled with examples of people who received sudden wealth and lost it, not because they lacked opportunity, but because they lacked preparation. Money amplifies habits. Good habits create opportunity. Poor habits create risk. That's why preparation matters so much. And that's why the smartest investors are already thinking ahead. Not obsessively, not emotionally, calmly, strategically, deliberately. Because when opportunities finally arrive, preparation creates confidence. Confidence reduces mistakes. And fewer mistakes usually lead to better outcomes. Now, before we move into part 4, there's another perspective we need to explore, one that often gets ignored in investor discussions. We've spent years talking about what a revaluation could mean for holders outside Iraq. But what about the people living inside Iraq? What would a stronger dinar mean for ordinary Iraqi families, for workers, for students, for parents trying to build a better future? Because understanding their perspective may reveal something extremely important about why Iraqi leadership remains motivated to complete these reforms. And once you see that motivation clearly, you'll understand why many analysts believe the pressure to move forward is stronger today than it has been in years. That's where we're going next. And trust me, the human side of this story may be the most powerful part of all. Why Iraq's leaders need this reform more than ever. Welcome back to Global Currency Watch. Up to this point, We've looked at the investor side of the story. We've discussed the signals coming from the central bank. We've examined the role of Iran. We've talked about rate structures, banking relationships, and preparation. But now I want to shift the focus, because there is another side to this story that many investors rarely think about. The people of Iraq. The truth is, every discussion about monetary reform eventually comes back to one simple question. Why would Iraq's leaders want this to happen? Not why investors want it. Not why analysts talk about it. Not why international institutions might support it. Why would Iraq itself want it? The answer may be simpler than many people realize. Because a stronger currency changes lives. And for a government trying to prove it can deliver meaningful change, few tools are more powerful than improving the purchasing power of its citizens. Think about everyday life for a moment. Imagine earning your salary in a currency that struggles to buy what your family needs. Imagine watching imported goods become more expensive. Imagine seeing medicine, technology, education, and opportunities remain just beyond reach. Now imagine that currency becoming stronger. Suddenly, imported products become more affordable. Medical treatments become more accessible. Educational opportunities expand. Families gain more purchasing power without necessarily earning more money. The value of what they already earn begins to stretch further. For millions of Iraqi citizens, that isn't a financial theory. It's daily life. And that's why monetary reform carries such powerful political significance. A stronger currency isn't just an economic event. It's a public confidence event. It's something citizens can feel. Something they can see, something that affects households immediately, and that matters enormously to any government. Now let's talk about leadership. Prime Minister al-Sudani has repeatedly emphasized economic reform, banking modernization, foreign investment, and improving living standards. Those aren't random talking points. Those are measurable goals, goals that require results. Because governments ultimately survive on one thing: public confidence. Citizens want to see progress. Investors want stability. Businesses want predictability. International partners want reliability. All of those objectives point toward the same destination: a stronger and more modern Iraqi economy. And that's exactly why many analysts continue paying close attention to Iraq's reform agenda. Not because every announcement guarantees immediate change, but because the direction remains consistent. And consistency matters, especially in long-term economic transformations. Let's be honest, the last 2 decades have not been easy for Iraq. War, political instability, security challenges, economic disruptions, regional tensions. All of these factors created obstacles that slowed progress. But despite those challenges, Iraq continued moving forward. Its oil sector expanded. Its foreign reserves increased. Its banking infrastructure improved. Its digital payment systems evolved. Its international partnerships strengthened. Those developments didn't happen overnight. They happened gradually, piece by piece, year by year. And now many observers believe those pieces are beginning to connect. Not perfectly, not instantly, but visibly. That matters because major economic transformations rarely happen through a single dramatic event. They happen through accumulation. Small changes build on other small changes. Reforms support additional reforms. Infrastructure enables new opportunities. Confidence attracts investment. Investment creates growth. Growth creates momentum. Momentum creates change. And eventually what once looked impossible begins to look inevitable. That doesn't mean timelines are certain. It doesn't mean setbacks can't happen. It doesn't mean challenges disappear. But it does mean progress becomes easier to recognize. Now let's talk about something many investors overlook: international perception. Because currencies aren't valued solely by domestic factors. They're influenced by how the world sees a country. Investors ask questions. Can this country support growth? Can it maintain stability? Can it honor agreements? Can it attract capital? Can it protect investments? Every reform Iraq completes helps answer those questions. Every modernization effort improves confidence. Every successful implementation strengthens credibility. And credibility is one of the most valuable assets any nation can possess. That's why the current phase feels different to many long-time observers. Not because someone announced a magical date, not because of rumors, not because of speculation, but because the institutional groundwork appears stronger than it has in years. The banking sector looks different. The technology infrastructure looks different. The international engagement looks different. The conversations coming from leadership sound different. And when enough things begin changing in the same direction, people start paying attention. Now, does that guarantee a specific outcome? Of course not. Serious analysis never deals in guarantees, but it does recognize trends. And the trend many analysts see today is one of continued movement toward modernization, integration, and reform. Which brings us to the most important question of all. If these reforms continue, if the next phase advances, if the final obstacles begin clearing, what happens when the opportunity finally arrives? More importantly, will you be ready? Because in the final part of this series, we're going to discuss what may be the single most valuable piece of advice shared this week. Advice that could potentially save investors thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of dollars. Not because of the rate, not because of timing, but because of how they respond when the moment finally comes. And trust me, that lesson could be worth more than any prediction you've ever heard. The 90-day rule that could save dinar investors thousands. The 90-day rule that could save dinar holders thousands. Welcome back to Global Currency Watch. If you've stayed with me through this entire series, thank you, because what we've covered isn't just another collection of rumors, predictions, or emotional headlines. We've looked at the bigger picture. We've examined the signals coming from Iraq. We've discussed the geopolitical gate many analysts believe still remains. We've explored the rate structure being discussed by major voices in the community. And we've talked about why preparation matters more than speculation. Now it's time for the most important lesson of all, the lesson that could ultimately determine whether years of patience translate into a smart financial outcome. And surprisingly, it has nothing to do with the exchange rate itself. It has everything to do with your behavior when the moment finally arrives. This week, Stephen shared something that immediately caught my attention, not because it was dramatic, not because it promised a date, but because it was practical. He suggested that when a major exchange event occurs, investors may have approximately 90 days to complete their exchange process. Think about that for a moment. 90 days, 3 full months, 12 weeks. That is a very different picture than the one many people carry in their minds. For years, some investors have imagined a frantic race, a limited window, a rush to the bank, a fear of missing out, an urgency that forces immediate decisions. But what if that's not reality? What if the real challenge isn't speed? What if the real challenge is discipline? Because discipline is much harder than panic. Panic feels natural. Discipline requires control. Imagine the moment arrives. After years of waiting, after countless articles, after endless speculation, after every emotional high and low, suddenly the news breaks. The event everyone has discussed for years appears to be happening. What will people do? Many will rush. Many will act immediately. Many will allow excitement to make decisions for them. And that's exactly what Stephen warned against. He pointed out that rushing through a major financial event can be extremely expensive, not because the investment failed, not because the opportunity disappeared, but because poor decisions are often made under pressure. Think about it. Would you make the biggest financial decision of your life in a state of excitement? Would you sign documents without reading them carefully? Would you accept the first offer without understanding your options? Would you ignore professional advice because you're afraid someone else might get ahead of you? Most people would say no. Yet that's exactly what happens during emotionally charged financial events. History proves it over and over again. The people who stay calm usually perform better than the people who move fastest. That's not just true for currency exchanges. It's true for investing. It's true for business. It's true for life. The calm person in the room often makes the best decisions. And that's where the 90-day concept becomes so powerful. Because if you truly have time, then you have something incredibly valuable: perspective. You have time to call your bank, time to understand your options, time to compare institutions, time to consult professionals, time to think clearly, time to avoid mistakes. And avoiding mistakes can be worth far more than chasing a slightly better rate. Now let's connect everything we've discussed throughout this series. The central bank signal highlighted by MNT. GOAT pointed investors toward the bigger geopolitical picture. The Iran factor remains one of the most important developments to watch. Frank's comments reminded investors that a currency event may be a process rather than a single moment. Jeff's perspective encouraged people to focus on real banking relationships instead of relying entirely on theories they cannot verify. The broader reform efforts inside Iraq continue pointing toward modernization and economic transformation. And Stephen's advice brought everything back to where it belongs: preparation. Because preparation is the common thread connecting all of these discussions. Preparation is what transforms opportunity into results. Preparation is what separates confidence from confusion. Preparation is what allows you to act intelligently when others are acting emotionally. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson of all. The people who benefit most from major opportunities are rarely the luckiest people. They're usually the most prepared people. The ones who did the work beforehand. The ones who built relationships. The ones who educated themselves. The ones who developed a plan long before the spotlight arrived. That's what this channel has always been about. Not hype, not fear, not emotional roller coasters. Preparation, clear thinking, and understanding the difference between noise and meaningful signals. As we close this series, I want to leave you with one final thought. The journey you've been on has required patience. A lot of patience. More patience than many people would have maintained. But patience alone is not enough. Patience must be paired with preparation. Because when opportunity finally arrives, preparation becomes the bridge between possibility and reality. So continue learning, continue watching the real indicators, continue building your knowledge, continue preparing your strategy, and most importantly, continue staying calm, because calm investors make better decisions, and better decisions create better outcomes. Thank you for spending your time with me here on Global Currency Watch. If you found value in this series, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who appreciates thoughtful analysis over speculation. I truly appreciate every one of you. Until next time, stay informed, stay prepared, and keep watching the signals that matter. This is Global Currency Watch, signing off.